Margaret Walsh, a nurse who spent 30 years healing others, found herself betrayed by her own body-crippling arthritis that left her unable to walk to her mailbox, abandoned by a medical system that offered only pills that never worked. The doctors, with their expensive tests and endless prescriptions, had turned her suffering into profit while she lost everything: her mobility, her grandchildren's laughter, her very will to live. But a simple message from an old colleague about an 81-year-old woman's morning ritual on cold bathroom tile changed everything in ways no one could have predicted. What happened next not only gave Margaret back her life, but sparked a movement that proved sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the places medicine refuses to look. Margaret Walsh's eyes snapped open at 4 a.m., yanked from sleep by the throbbing pain that had become her cruel alarm clock. At 58, this had been her routine for the past decade. Waking to agony before dawn ever broke through the bedroom curtains. She lay motionless in the darkness, staring at the ceiling she could barely see, gathering whatever strength she had left for what came next. The transition from lying down to sitting up, something most people never thought twice about, had become Margaret's daily mountain to climb. She shifted her weight slowly, feeling her knee joints grind and protest with every micro movement. The sensation was like broken glass scraping against bone, sharp and unforgiving. Her hands shot out instinctively to grip the edge of the nightstand, fingers wrapping around the solid oak surface with desperate force. Using the nightstand as an anchor, Margaret pulled herself upward. The pain exploded through her legs in waves, each one more intense than the last. It felt like thousands of needles were driving deep into the bone, finding every nerve ending and setting it ablaze. She bit down hard on her lower lip, refusing to cry out. There was no one to hear her anyway, and she had learned long ago that vocalized suffering only amplified the loneliness. Finally vertical, sitting on the edge of the bed with both feet touching the cold hardwood floor, Margaret allowed herself a moment to breathe. Sweat had formed on her forehead despite the coolness of the early morning air. Her hands moved automatically to her knees, fingers pressing gently into the swollen, hot tissue, massaging in slow circles. It never really helped. 10 years had taught her that, but the ritual gave her something to focus on besides the relentless ache. For 30 years, Margaret had worked as a nurse at Cedar Valley Hospital. She had spent 3 decades on her feet, caring for others, holding hands during difficult diagnoses, administering medications that brought relief, celebrating recoveries. She had been the steady presence that patients relied on, the professional who always had an answer. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She had helped thousands of people. Yet when it came to her own body's betrayal, she was utterly helpless. The parade of doctors had been endless and equally useless. Orthopedic specialists who examined her x-rays with clinical detachment, rheumatologists who ordered blood tests and scans, pain management experts who spoke in technical terms about inflammation and cartilage deterioration. Each one had offered the same conclusion: severe osteoarthritis with no cure. They prescribed medications with complicated names, each bottle promising relief that rarely lasted beyond a few hours of dulled sensation. Margaret's gaze drifted to the photographs on her dresser. Sarah smiled from her college graduation photo, that image now 12 years old. Her daughter lived in Oregon with her husband and 2 children, 1,000 miles away. They video called when they could, but Margaret could never bring herself to be honest about how bad things had gotten. Thomas appeared in his wedding photo, handsome in his tuxedo. He had moved to Texas for work and called once a month, the conversations feeling more like obligation than genuine connection. The largest photograph sat in a silver frame on the nightstand. David, her husband, captured on their 30th wedding anniversary. He was laughing, his arm around her shoulders, both of them sun-kissed and happy after a day at the beach. That was 6 years ago, 3 years before the heart attack that stole him from her without warning, without goodbye. David's death had shattered something fundamental inside Margaret. The house, once alive with conversation and laughter, now echoed with emptiness. Every room held memories that cut like knives. The kitchen where they had danced to old Motown songs while cooking dinner. The living room where they had watched movies curled together on the couch. The garden where David had spent hours tending his tomatoes and roses. In the pre-dawn darkness, Margaret felt the crushing weight of her isolation. The children had their own lives, their own families demanding attention. How could she burden them with her daily reality? that their mother, who had always been strong and capable, was now struggling to walk from bedroom to bathroom without wincing, that she spent her days watching the clock, counting minutes until the next dose of medication. Margaret's mind drifted to better times. She remembered jogging around Lake Morrison at sunrise, her running shoes crunching on the gravel path, her body strong and pain-free. She could see dawn painting the water in shades of pink and gold, mist rising from the surface. That Margaret had been unstoppable, full of life and hope. She remembered dancing with David in their kitchen, those spontaneous moments when a favorite song came on, and he would pull her close, spinning her around the cramped space. Her body had moved easily then, both of them laughing when they bumped into furniture. Those simple moments of joy now seemed to belong to someone else's life. The memories of her grandchildren cut deepest. Little Emma and Jack running through grass at the park, begging her to push them on swings, to race them to the big oak tree. She had been an engaged grandmother then, getting down on the ground to examine bugs, lifting them high until they squealed with delight. The last time she saw them, 6 months ago, she had watched from a bench while Sarah played with the children, unable to participate. Margaret pulled open the nightstand drawer, the wood scraping. Inside lay the evidence of her decline, empty medication bottles and blister packs forming a small mountain. She picked up the newest prescription, the label promising these pills would be more effective, stronger than all the ones before. The doctor had been so confident, but Margaret knew better. Each new medication started with hope and ended in disappointment. The mountain of empty packaging told the real story, a timeline measured in pills that had failed her one by one. She held the new bottle, and something inside her cracked. Tears came suddenly, burning behind her closed eyelids. Margaret tried to hold them back, but it was useless. They spilled over, running down her cheeks in silent streams. This wasn't about physical pain. Margaret had learned to coexist with that. This was grief for everything she had lost and would never get back. The pain had stopped being just physical long ago. It had become an emotional presence that pressed down on her spirit as relentlessly as it attacked her joints. It colored every thought, limited every possibility. Margaret wasn't just dealing with arthritis, she was imprisoned by it. She sat there as darkness began to lighten, tears flowing, holding pills she knew wouldn't save her, surrounded by ghosts of the life she used to have. Outside, the world was waking, people planning their days, doing ordinary things Margaret could no longer do. And in that moment, sitting at 4 a.m. with aching knees and a broken heart, Margaret understood she had reached absolute bottom. This wasn't living, it was merely existing, surviving hour by hour, waiting for the next dose to temporarily numb the pain that had become the defining feature of her existence. Something had to change, but she had no idea what, or how, or if change was even possible anymore. The despair came in waves, each one pulling Margaret deeper into isolation. Phone calls from Sarah and Thomas went unanswered, her finger hovering over the screen before letting them go to voicemail. How could she tell her children that their mother could barely make it to the mailbox without stopping to rest? The excuses came easily at first. She was tired. She'd been sleeping. She'd call back later. But later never came. Her friends stopped inviting her out after months of rejected offers. Book club on Tuesdays, lunch with former nursing colleagues on Fridays, Sunday services at church. She abandoned them all, one by one. The invitations eventually stopped coming, and Margaret was left with exactly what she'd created, complete isolation. Her house became her prison, the walls closing in, with pain as her only constant companion. One evening, mindlessly scrolling through social media in the darkness, Margaret saw a post from Linda Chen, an old colleague from Cedar Valley Hospital. The words stopped her cold. 1 year ago, I could barely walk across a room because of arthritis. Today, I hiked 5 miles with my daughter. Sometimes the answer isn't where you expect to find it. Margaret stared at the screen, reading it over and over, that unfamiliar feeling stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, but something close. Curiosity mixed with desperate jealousy. Her fingers moved almost without thought, typing a message. Linda, I saw your post about your arthritis recovery. I'm struggling with the same thing. If you're willing to share what helped you, I'd really appreciate it. She hit send, immediately regretting it. Linda probably wouldn't even remember her. But 53 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a long message. Linda explained that a year ago, she'd been in the same desperate place, living with her daughter, barely able to function, resigned to being a burden. Then she noticed something strange about her daughter's mother-in-law, Helen, every morning. The 81-year-old woman spent exactly 15 minutes in the bathroom, standing barefoot on the cold tile floor, slowly rocking from heel to toe. When Linda finally asked what she was doing, Helen answered simply, "This is the only thing that keeps my joints alive. Been doing it 30 years. Doctors said I'd be in a wheelchair by 60. I'm 81 and still work in my garden 3 hours a day." Linda had been skeptical but desperate enough to try. "The first week I thought it was making things worse, but by day 10 the morning stiffness was slightly less. By month 3 I'd cut my pain medication in half. Now a year later, I'm living a life I thought was gone forever." Margaret read the message 3 times. Standing on cold floor? That was it? Not surgery, not medication, not any legitimate medical intervention, just barefoot on tile, rocking back and forth. Her nurse's training screamed that this was absurd, some placebo effect or natural remission. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the specific details, the exact 15 minutes, Linda's honesty about the difficult first week. Maybe it was that Linda had been a nurse too, someone trained to think critically. Or maybe it was just that the despair had become so deep that even absurdity looked like a lifeline worth grabbing. The next morning, Margaret woke at 3:30 a.m. to familiar pain. She lay there arguing with herself for several minutes before the quieter voice won. "What do you have to lose?" She pushed herself up and began the slow journey to the bathroom, each step deliberate, her hand trailing the wall for support. When she flipped on the light, the plain white tile looked ordinary. Nothing special. Margaret placed one bare foot on it and gasped. The cold was shocking, almost burning. She put her other foot down and gripped the sink edge, knuckles white. This was insane. But Linda's words echoed. "The first week, I thought it was making things worse." In Helen's simple statement, "This is the only thing that keeps my joints alive." Slowly, Margaret shifted her weight back onto her heels, feeling the cold penetrate deeper. Then she rolled forward onto the balls of her feet. Back to heels, forward to toes. The movement was small, controlled, almost meditative. The pain in her knees screamed in protest. She checked her phone. Only 2 minutes had passed. 13 more stretched ahead like an impossible distance. At 8 minutes, her calves cramped. At 10, she considered quitting. At 12, tears ran down her face. But she kept going. Heel, toe, heel, toe. When 15 minutes finally elapsed, Margaret stopped, breathing hard. Her feet were numb. Her knees felt like fire. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion. She felt worse than when she'd started, but she'd done it. And for reasons she couldn't articulate, that mattered. The first 3 days brought nothing. Margaret continued the ritual out of pure stubbornness, standing on cold tile each morning, but the pain remained as fierce as ever. She felt foolish, convinced she'd fallen for desperate fantasy. But on the 4th morning, something shifted. As she stood from bed, the pain was still there, sharp and present, but the edges felt softer somehow. Not gone, just less jagged. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, good sleep position, weather. But that tiny spark of hope refused to die. By day 7, Margaret descended her staircase with only one hand on the railing. The other swung naturally at her side instead of clutching desperately for support. She reached the bottom and stared back up in disbelief at what she'd just accomplished. 2 weeks in, she walked to the mailbox without stopping. 60 feet that usually required rest breaks took less than 3 minutes. Standing in her entryway with mail in hand, Margaret felt tears threatening. These were such her small victories, stairs without 2 hands, a walk without stopping. But for her, they were monumental. The changes accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, like water droplets filling a vessel. Each morning brought tiny improvements that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively transformed everything. 3 weeks in, Margaret called Linda, her voice shaking with excitement. "It's working. I don't understand how, but it's actually working." Linda explained what she'd learned. The cold stimulated blood circulation, bringing oxygen and nutrients to inflamed joints. The rocking motion created pressure on reflexology points in the feet, connected to the knees and hips through nerve pathways. Helen didn't know the science. She just discovered it worked and kept doing it. Margaret dove into research, her nurse's mind hungry for understanding. She learned about thermoreceptors responding to cold, reducing inflammation and pain signals. She read about the 7,000 nerve endings in each foot connected through the nervous system to the entire body. The gentle pressure stimulated mechanoreceptors that influence pain perception through neural pathways. What struck her most was the simplicity. This required no equipment, no medical supervision, just 15 minutes and a bathroom floor. And perhaps that's exactly why traditional medicine never embraced it. There was no profit in telling patients to stand on cold tile. No pharmaceutical company could patent it. The incentive structure pushed toward monetizable interventions, not simple practices empowering patients to help themselves. The scientific understanding gave Margaret confidence. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was her body responding to specific, measurable stimuli in predictable ways. 4 weeks later, Margaret sat in her car, keys in hand. She hadn't driven in 3 months, but this morning she'd decided to visit Sarah. The 3-hour drive felt almost easy. Her knee bent comfortably. The subtle shifts required for highway driving didn't send shooting pains through her joints. When she rang Sarah's doorbell, her daughter's face cycled through surprise, confusion, and shock. "Mom, you drove here? By yourself? Where's your cane?" Margaret smiled. "Can I come in? I have something to tell you." Sarah pulled her into a hug and immediately felt the difference. Her mother's arms were strong, holding her with firm pressure, not the tentative embrace of someone whose body might betray them. This was the hug Sarah remembered from childhood. "Mom, what happened? Last time I saw you, you could barely walk." Margaret told her everything about Linda's message. Helen's morning ritual, the cold tile floor, 15 minutes that had given her back her life. When Emma and Jack got home from school, Emma asked tentatively if Grandma could push her on the swing. Margaret's heart clenched. "I'd love to, sweetheart." And she did. She stood behind her granddaughter and pushed, watching Emma's delighted face. Jack wanted to race to the big tree, and Margaret power-walked beside him, both of them laughing. These were ordinary things good grandmothers did, but for Margaret, they were miracles reclaimed. Driving home that evening, Margaret felt peace settle in her chest. She wasn't cured. Tomorrow would still bring pain, would still require her 15-minute ritual. But she had her life back. She had possibilities again. And that was more than she dared to hope for just a month ago. Later that evening at Sarah's kitchen table, Margaret told her daughter everything. The science, Linda's message, Helen's 30-year ritual, the terrible first week, the tiny improvements that accumulated into something significant. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face. "Something so simple brought you back to us. Do you know how scared I've been? How many nights I've worried about you alone in that house? I'm sorry I shut you out." "I was ashamed," Margaret said quietly. "You're still my mother, no matter what. We need to call Thomas. He needs to know." When Thomas's face appeared on Sarah's phone screen, his confusion was immediate. "Mom, but I thought you could barely walk." "That was 3 months ago, honey. A lot has changed." Margaret and Sarah explained everything. Thomas listened in amazement, struggling to accept that something so simple could work. When they finished, his voice was rough with emotion. "Mom, I wish you'd reached out sooner." "That's on me, not you," Margaret said firmly. "But Thomas, for the first time in years, I have plans, real plans. I want to volunteer at the hospital again. I want to teach Emma and Jack how to bake Grandpa's chocolate chip cookies. I want to live, not just exist." "That's all I've wanted for you, Mom," Thomas said. "I'm flying out next month with Rachel and the kids. No excuses." "No excuses," Margaret agreed. Driving home the next day, Margaret felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known in a decade. An idea took root. How many others were suffering the way she had been? She thought about Linda's willingness to share, about Helen's simple wisdom. Margaret wanted to be part of that chain. She approached the local library about hosting a monthly meeting for people with chronic joint pain. The librarian, who walked with a pronounced limp, immediately understood. "We have a community room. When do you want to start?" 5 people came to the first meeting. Margaret shared her story without embellishment, emphasizing she wasn't a doctor, wasn't selling anything, wasn't promising miracles. I'm just someone who found something that worked, and I wanted to share it. A younger man named Derek spoke hesitantly. I'm 38 and can barely play with my kids. This sounds too simple to work, but I've got nothing to lose. That's exactly how I felt, Margaret said. By the second meeting, 8 people came. Derek reported improvement. By the fourth meeting, 18 participants filled the room. Stories circulated, someone who'd gardened for the first time in years, another who'd walked their dog without stopping, a grandmother who'd picked up her granddaughter. Not everyone experienced dramatic results. Some reported minimal improvement. Others plateaued. Margaret was honest about these outcomes, never overpromising. But even for those with modest improvements, the impact was significant. When you live with constant pain, even a small reduction felt monumental. 3 months after starting the group, Margaret had 23 regular attendees. She understood now that she wasn't a healer, just someone who'd found a path and wanted to share it with others walking the same difficult road. One evening, Margaret stood at her living room window, looking out at Lake Morrison, where she'd once run every morning. Tomorrow she'd stand on the cold bathroom floor again, as she had every day for 3 months now. The pain hadn't disappeared completely, it was still there, a quiet reminder of worn joints and years lived. But she wasn't its prisoner anymore. She'd learned to manage the pain instead of letting it manage her. That was her victory. Not miraculous healing, but reconciliation with her own body. Understanding that even when medicine fell short, a person could still find their own path forward. Margaret smiled as morning light began filling the room with warmth. She thought about David, imagining what he'd say if he could see her now. He'd be proud. She'd learned something she thought was lost forever. She'd learned how to live again.